began to find evidence that the self-aware part of who we are is not always in charge. Obviously, we're going to make some biblical metaphors out of this in a moment. But that humans are sometimes deeply influenced by perceptions, thoughts, feelings, desires that are not part of who the real them is. It's this inner zombie. And the boldest claims in that article, people can just go and read the article, could inner zombies be controlling your brain? Their boldest claims had to do with what they said was mounting evidence of the inner zombie being at work, and how that these scientists who were doing this study, were finding that the I, the intuitive feeling that there is an executive I think that's the phrase they use.
Right, or the third eye the occultists use.
Well, but they were saying the I that you think you are, the you that you think sits in a control room somehow in your brain, scanning the screens of your senses and pushing the buttons of your muscles and telling you where to go and whatever, that is sometimes an illusion. And now, the spiritual side of this that you brought out several fascinating things. One having to do with lordship, and that somebody or something may be able to remotely influence a person. And this too, of course, could play into part of this great deception and this dark awakening. For instance, this article talked about how that earlier this year there was this team of these researchers at Copenhagen, I think. They were talking about how they had these 11 healthy people, and they were able to temporarily blind these people by focusing a beam of magnetism at the back of their heads. Now, this could totally take us into talking about psychotronic weapons, but they talked about how they could do that, how it interfered with the activity of the neurons in the visual cortex portion of their brains. But they said that the zombie part of the brain in those experiments, in half, not all, half of their subjects took over. And that zombie part of the brain could still see and was making decisions in place of the self-aware person. Anyway, the fact that this zombie side of half of these subjects could be remotely controlled, it reminded me of several things. One, how the Bible says that God will keep in perfect peace those whose mind is stayed on Him. You remember that?
Sure, and casting down, taking every thought captive to the obedience of the cross of Jesus. If you've got to take something captive, then that automatically is presupposing that there are non-captive thoughts that are controlling you that must be taken under captivity, or they will control you.
That's right. Other verses that have to do with the fact that we become the servant of whoever we make ourselves servants to obey. But thirdly, it reminded me of this. Did you see the article in Wired magazine maybe about 3-4 weeks ago now? And it was called Top Pentagon Scientists Fear Brain Modified Foes. Did you see that article?
Yeah, I did. I actually read Wired, or I look at Wired every day.
Well, this whole article had to do with how there's concern now in some corners of the U.S. military about enemy activities in mind enhancement research. And they were talking about neuropharmaceutical performance enhancement, brain-computer interfaces, all the stuff you and I have talked about before, and I've talked about ad nauseum on other shows. But what they were saying, and this was what stood out to me, was that the warning against this was not coming from the Pentagon's scientific fringe. Some tin-hat kook with a Defense Department badge. This was coming from the celebrated scientists on the Pentagon's most prestigious scientific advisory panel, Jason. The Jasons, they are the highest. And they were the ones who were worried that our adversaries might create technology that could exploit advances in human performance modification having to do with the brain and that this could become a national security. And so they started advocating that the American military start both funding and pushing ahead with its own performance, mind enhancement, brain enhancement research to make sure that U.S. enemies don't suddenly become smarter, faster, better able to endure the harsh realities of war than American troops. Now, Steve, you and I have done like a 5 or 6 hour show on psychotronic warfare, so we don't need to go back there again. What stood out to me about this has to do with this Black Awakening. Imagine this Black Awakening, this dark Manchurian candidates situation.
I would say this too: demon-possessed, non-human intelligence activated vessels.
Steve, it could mean something entirely more frightening than most people can even imagine. I mean, when you take the genetic modification of humans and transhumans, and the whole transhumanist aspiration, which we're reading about this on the superficial level, but the transhumanist aspiration has been codified within U.S. military doctrine for at least 20 years now. Take all of that into consideration, and imagine what this might mean in terms of a Black Awakening. WorldNet Daily, they're going to be running, people will read this after the fact, but they're going to be running their top story tomorrow at WorldNet Daily on my book, Nephilim Stargates, on this whole idea that biotech could be leading back to the incarnating of supernatural unknowns.
Well, that's true, Tom. That's the whole basis of genetic Armageddon when I wrote it. Today's technology, tomorrow's monsters. Let me even go one step further. Let's say that the powers that be, the Luciferians, the devil worshippers, those who are servants of Satan, descendants of darkness, let's say that they have replaced, through advanced cloning, advanced genetic engineering, some of the most powerful and well-recognized figures in the world. And let's suppose those most well-recognized figures now have another entity, a non-human entity. In other words, demonic possession, a supernatural intelligence that motivates them. And understand this, it will be pretty easy to see how all of the leaders of the earth would give their power over to the beast, is it not?
Well, yeah. I mean, imagine Pastor Russ Disdar's idea about a Black Awakening, but not with humans. With humans who are part human, part something else, who are in tune with supernatural unknowns, actually being controlled by them. The whole question, a lot of what I actually talk about, when I go on to some of the, the mainstream shows, which they can't talk at depth like you and I do, and so I have to kind of superficialize the discussion. But I always try to ask this question, how might changing us as a species, and especially integrating us with the animal species, which, according to all these ancient records, is exactly what the Watchers did, how might that open doors or gateways of the mind, which frankly we don't know very much about, Steve, including why there are parts of our brain, most of our brain, that seems to be closed off beyond our understanding, closed off since the time of the fall. Will those regions of the mind, brain, be reopened through altering us, through blending us with other species? I can tell you, because I've debated leading transhumanists on their own shows, and I'm talking about people who have PhDs and who are ethicists at leading universities. I've been on their shows, I've debated them, and in fact was told by one of them that I actually made a better case than he did, but he told me that off the air. He didn't tell me that on the air. But these people not only believe that we might be able to peer into what we think of as the supernatural, they actually hope so. The Finnish Transhumanist Association even published a study about all this not long ago, and they actually talked about how super intelligence might be reached through this technology. And what astonished me about the research was they said that this would be a creation that might be able to capable, if you will, of doing